This talk's about depenguinating your infrastructure, or specifically at our company, we're a FreeBSD shop. We have about 80 FreeBSD servers spread around the globe. But one of our particular applications required Linux, and the FreeBSD Linuxulator wasn't up to the task. So our very nice infrastructure was polluted by these two CentOS servers sitting off in a corner. And once FreeBSD 10 came out, we were able to leverage bhyve to solve that particular problem. So my name is Allan Jude. I've been a FreeBSD sysadmin for 12 odd years now, and I do quite a bit of work on stuff. I'm the architect at Scale Engine. It's a content distribution network. We deal with delivering HTTP objects like images and CSS files and so on, as well as live video streaming all over the world. And I host the BSD Now podcast. It's a weekly video show where we interview people like Peter and Brooks and everybody else about BSD and what they're working on and what's new. And that's every Wednesday. You can watch it live on Wednesdays or download it on Friday when the edited version comes out. We use Puppet to manage our infrastructure, so we've been doing that for a while. I gave a talk on that at BSDCan last year. And we use a lot of ZFS because we're doing video. We have giant gobs of storage, and so we have to deal with that. But we also use ZFS for the opposite, dealing with very large numbers of very small files. We found that sometimes the performance on UFS, getting a directory listing when you have giant nested directories was not as well. So tweaking ZFS to use more metadata cache and so on. bhyve. I first heard of bhyve, I guess, 2 BSD cans ago when Michael gave his talk about the state of the various multiplicity options, whether it's Jails or Zen or bhyve and so on. And I got interested in it, but at the time there wasn't too much you could do with it, and it really wasn't that pretty yet. But then at, I guess it was EuroBSDCon later that year, it had come along a little ways. You could actually just boot FreeBSD in it, and it was usable. And so I started using it, and it just happened that after I got home from EuroBSDCon, I got a delivery of a server, brand new machine with 24 cores and 96 gigs of RAM and so on, and tried out bhyve on it since I hadn't installed anything on it yet. It was going to go in production in a couple of weeks. And found some of the limitations of bhyve. I think back originally you couldn't have more than 8 CPUs. I think the limit now is 16.
Yes.
When's that going to go up?
So you can conditionally compile it, but we want to restructure how we represent CPUs. It's a little wasteful. It certainly doesn't scale very well. Sometimes.
Because most of the machines that are running bhyve on have 24 cores, and with video transcoding, you want all of the cores.
Yeah. We actually have some scaling issues, even with the way we deal with multiprocessor systems. So an example is interprocessor interrupts. We handle them very inefficiently at the moment. So we probably want to try to fix that before we bump the CPUs up again.
Right. We also found some problems with ZFS. I remember it was EuroBSDCon last year. I was trying to work on the changes. I was helping with the FreeBSD installer to make it support root on ZFS. And when you created a ZFS pool on FreeBSD in bhyve, the Vertile block would throw an assertion. And I talked to Peter about that, and he emailed me a patch a couple hours later. And we got that solved. And then, I was like, all right, so when will I be able to boot root on ZFS in bhyve? And now is that in head now?
Yes.
Right. So yay for that as well. And as Michael mentioned earlier, I have just gotten this new E5 2620B2, which is the very latest Intel architecture. And Neil was like, we need a machine like that to test some new features, posted interrupt processing and virtual interrupt delivery, which are new hardware-assisted virtualization features that Intel has introduced. And Peter and Neil didn't have that hardware laying around because it's very new and very expensive. And so we had just bought this server and it wasn't in production yet, so we loaned it to Neil for a week and he managed to get those two features built and committed. So at Scale Engine, like I said, we do HTTP delivery and video streaming. We do about 150 terabytes a month of HTTP. A good portion of that now is all of the mirrors for PCBSD, the ISOs and the packages, and bumped up the traffic quite a bit. And then we do about 200 terabytes a month of video, live and on demand. And then we manage all of our servers with Puppet. We have both, as I said on the previous slide, about 80 servers spread across 32 different data centers in 11 countries. And so managing all that by myself was a challenge until we started using Puppet to do it. And one of the other things we do is we use jails. So we create individual applications that run in a jail and then deploy multiple jails on a machine, and it has those roles now. And that's worked very well for us. But the video streaming software we use, Wowza Media Server, is a commercial application which we have to pay a license for, and it's Java. So using OpenJDK 7, that's run fine on FreeBSD for us. Originally using Java and then later OpenJDK. However, to do video transcoding, to take in video at a high bit rate and generate lower bit rate versions of it for mobile and so on, or to change the video codec, the libraries they provide are native to Linux. And it's 64-bit, so we can't just use the Linux emulator because that's 32-bit only. And we tried various other things like the Debian and KFreeBSD and everything else we could think of, and the only solution that seemed to work was running CentOS. But that posed some issues for us. First of all, I don't like CentOS, and I'm not very good at it. And that means it takes more time and it causes me issues and so on. And also our entire management framework is predicated on using FreeBSD and Jails. And so it meant that these transcoding servers that ran Linux, because they don't have jails and they didn't fit into our infrastructure to be able to have all the other roles. So that meant that entire machine was now dedicated to transcoding, which meant that it was wasting resources when there wasn't a lot of transcoding going on. Transcoding is usually live events, so they're scheduled, and maybe it happens every week, but not usually. So that means oftentimes the server will sit there for 5 days doing nothing, and having that serve up HTTP traffic in the meantime means that that's not wasted hardware that we're paying for. And basically, when it was Linux, we didn't have the option to do things like that. And so bhyve rescued us there, allowed us to keep the machine as FreeBSD, have our regular jails on it doing our roles to push HTTP or whatever. Also because we like using ZFS, and ZFS on Linux is a lot harder to do, especially you have to build the system yourself, and it's hard to do when it's on a remote system and so on. Because our replication system for moving, say, all the files for PCBSD mirrors between our servers is actually using ZFS replication. So ZFS is a requirement for our newer installations. So anyway, with FreeBSD 10, we gained bhyve in the base system that we could just use. And with the grub2 bhyve port, it's now possible to just boot CentOS on top of FreeBSD in a container, bhyve instead of a jail, but not that different. There were a few bugs, especially with booting Linux, so we've been running head instead of 10 release. How much the changes have been merged back into 10 stable?
I'll have to talk to you about exactly which ones, but not all of them.
Right. Is there something that is there a reason they're not merged yet, or is it just waiting for the timeout? Or?
It's just getting the time to allocate to pull them back and test them.
So yeah, that allows us to treat a bhyve similar to a jail. and then it kind of fits into our existing infrastructure that way. And it means the server can do all the other things we want it to do, right? It also allows the host system to be a normal part of our infrastructure and serve other kinds of traffic. So I have a Puppet recipe here for actually using Michael's VM script to deploy bhyves. So you can just add it to your manifest saying, we need these virtual machines to exist on the host, and they'll get created. We'd like it to be a little bit more like EasyJail, just because that's what we're used to, but it's pretty close so far. Yes, we really, really, really like EasyJail.
Okay.
So this is the Puppet manifest. Pretty simple. It just says when you define a bhyve with a name, it creates it by calling the script. That should be provision, not create, I think, to make it. I guess with the newer version of VM, you would have a template in there as well. And it knows what directory will be created when you do that, so it can tell whether the command's been run already or not. And then it notifies the service, and this service can hit that VM command and start and stop the service. It'll restart the bhyve automatically if it notices that it's stopped, if it crashes, for example. And you can also use it to check the status and create reports on that and so on. One thing we've been glad to learn is that the performance in bhyve has been quite good. Every time I ask Peter about it, he's like, "We don't test it. We don't care about performance yet."
So we do.
Oh.
We just don't advertise.
Yes. Right. He wants it to perform well, but he hasn't done much testing on it yet to tell how it's actually performing.
We're doing more and more.
Okay. Well, you're going to share it?
When it's ready.
Yeah. So the network performance has been fine to about a gigabit. I've done crazy things like exposing 4 Verdile net devices into the thing and lagging them together and trying to see how much you can push out of one. As the interface it emulates is actually 10 gigabit, but when your interface physically underneath isn't that fast, you run into problems actually trying to push that much out. But the CPU utilization is a bit high for doing full gigabit networking, but in our case, we usually don't need more than about 500 megabits, and we've never had any problems getting that in bhyve. It would be interesting to see what things like the new E1000 user space driver he was talking about, or specifically NetMap. I saw some stuff recently on NetMap, and I think it's called MSwitch or something. It's creating a software switch using NetMap and using that to network between bhyves. And if bhyves have things like TSO or large send offloading, then NetMap knows that and means that it doesn't ever get segmented. Right? You do the offload in bhyve, it goes into NetMap, which leaves it big, and then it becomes a large receive offload, and you just avoid the step of fragmenting the packet at all. So we're very interested in that going forward. If you wanted to create a network with multiple bhyves, having a virtual switch infrastructure and being able to route traffic between them would be extremely handy. So we just did some basic performance tests on my laptop this morning when I was writing these slides. But just doing the OpenSSL speed test and find that on the guest and the host, there's basically no difference in performance for CPU. Even using multiple CPUs with something like Ubench, I find that the performance CPU-wise in the guest is the same as the host.
What guest were you running?
This is just a 10 release guest.
Okay.
On a 10 release system. And so basically the performance is identical between the two. If you run it 10 times, the average is out to no difference. And even using something like Ubench where you're using multiple processors, there didn't seem to really be a penalty to the speed, even with the switches. I've been curious to see what happens with the pinning, whether having bhyve bouncing around between the physical cores actually makes a difference or not, performance-wise.
Yeah, so the ULE scheduler is actually quite good at keeping them pinged almost automatically.
Especially in 10, right?
Yes.
There was a change to make it do that more after 9.1, I think.
Right. In fact, there was a change in, I think, 2 weeks ago that may have taken that away a little bit. I'm not too sure. But basically, for something like this that's CPU bound, you'll pretty much see them just spread out, and they'll stay there for long periods of time.
Yeah.
Definitely, if they're ping-ponging around,
I think I saw a little bit of that when I was mostly playing with the networking, seeing it ping pong a little bit.
yeah. I mean, if you're not using full quantums, if you're just kind of I/O bound, you can ping-pong around, and that's actually not very good because you basically start with a completely fresh TLB if you move to another CPU. You can't trust any of the mappings that are there, so it's just flushed. So it's like if you just, periodically completely flushing a TLB, which usually hurts performance quite a bit.
Yeah. But overall, it does everything we need it to do, other than we'd like more CPUs because our host system has 24, but as you said, we could go in there and tweak it ourselves. We just changed the hard limit for now, but there's other scalability issues. But in general, we've been able to fairly easily run Linux guest and have the performance you would expect from running it on the hardware. So, deploying Linux on top of FreeBSD gives you all the tools you're used to on FreeBSD, right? So you still have the host system and you can still treat it as every other machine in your network, but then it just has this special kind of Linux jail running on it. And it means that the machine is still FreeBSD. You do FreeBSD things in addition to the Linux things instead of only. And especially it can be great for appliances. We've had this phone server for a while that runs some embedded Linux thing, and running that in bhyve might be advantageous, give us that hardware back as well. But mostly the performance, we were surprised by how little impact there was on performance. Even the disk I/O wasn't bad with the HCI on top of a Z-pool. The ARC makes up most of the difference there, but in general, things have been going quite well. And then just mention the podcast again. I do the weekly show about BSD, and then a second weekly show just about system administration in general and security and things like that. Any questions?
So this might be a question really for Peter, but besides CentOS, which is what you're running for the version of bhyve, any other Linux distributions that are? I think you mentioned Red Hat. Did you mention Red Hat earlier? Or?
Yeah. So I've run RHEL, R6, and R7 also works. Distributions that have Grub version 2 native are the best, just because it's Grub version 2 was the low. So Ubuntu 12 and onwards, that works pretty good. Debian as well. Trying to think. I know RHEL 5 doesn't work. Apparently there's some changes we're getting from someone else that will fix that. But that 6, is quite old. Most people seem to be running 6. It's very little 5 it seems around.
We used CentOS and Ubuntu, but most of them seem to work fairly well. Anything modern seems to work anyway.
Oh, I think I tried OpenSUSE. It was a little iffy. There seemed to be some issues there, but we mainly just tried to target what we thought was get the best reward for the least effort, and that was RHEL and Ubuntu.
And CentOS and RHEL are almost the same anyway, especially as far as booting. Any other questions?
It's not quite a question, but Allan was sort of meaningful user number 2. We appreciate that because you provided genuine hardware and genuine testing, and that's absolutely
Well,
appreciated.
it was very nice to get to meet Peter and Neil at the Meet BSD one year.
日本語ですみません。Linux を動かすときに結構いろんなものがデフォルトでは動いて、パフォーマンスに影響があると思うんですけど、そこら辺は苦労されましたか？極端に言うとシングルモードに近いような感じで、その必要なものだけ動作させるような形を取ったんでしょうか？
Could you repeat the question, please?
質問が長すぎてごめん。
動かす Linux の調整、
デー
パフォーマンス
モンとかを
の
全部切ったか。So, in typical Linux distribution, it's enabling so many services, daemons by default. So, he want to ask. So these services may harm the performance of the services. So, did you disable all of the things, or you use just the default configuration?
We disabled most of the services we didn't want, mostly for security reasons and so on. But we actually use Puppet inside, running inside on the CentOS as well. So we kind of had to adapt our stuff to do a little bit of Linux anyway. But that disables all the services that we don't especially need, because yes, they throw things off and get in the way, and do things you weren't expecting. Bad. That's another reason why we prefer not to need Linux at all. So, who's volunteering to fix the Linux emulator for 64-bit?
Apparently NetBSD has it, right? I could be wrong, but anyone? 64-bit compat Linux on NetBSD? Anyone?
There seem to be some people working on it for FreeBSD, it's just not very important, to be honest.
Well,
Increasingly important, I think.
Yeah, well, when Drew was working on the handbook page, she found that most of the scientific apps and so on that the handbook talked about using Linux Later 4 are all 64-bit only now.
Yeah.
There's nothing left for that chapter.
Yeah. But I don't know how much people use the Linux Later outside of Flash. Any other questions?